On a gloomy morning, an arrogant businessman drives his car along the mountain road. In the back seat, his 12-year-old blind son clutches a small violin, his only comfort since his mother's disappearance. "We're going on a special boat ride," he announces in a cold voice. Arriving at the river, he pushes his own son into the icy currents, watching as the boy struggles against the waters. He fails to notice the elderly fisherman who witnesses everything. What this old man does next will unearth buried secrets and change everyone's fate forever. Before we immerse ourselves in this poignant story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching narratives. On a crisp autumn morning, a mist clung to the churning river in the mountains like a ghostly shroud. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks created a natural symphony that seemed to foreshadow something extraordinary about to unfold in that remote setting. A luxurious black SUV snaked along the winding road that cut through the dense woods. Inside, Arthur Blackwood, a 48-year-old man dressed in an impeccably tailored Italian suit, kept his eyes fixed on the road with an expression that blended determination and a calculated coldness. His hands, adorned only by an exorbitantly priced Swiss watch, gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, betraying the inner turmoil hidden beneath his facade of absolute control. In the back seat, huddled against the window, Ethan, his son of just 12 years old, clutched a small violin as if it were his lifeline in an ocean of uncertainties. His eyes, though unable to see since birth, seemed to search for something beyond the perpetual darkness that constituted his world. The beauty of those blue eyes contrasted with the sadness that emanated from them. Ethan didn't need sight to sense that something was deeply wrong with this special outing his father had promised. "Dad, where exactly are we going?" Ethan asked, his small voice almost swallowed by the engine's hum and the sound of the light rain that had begun to fall. Arthur adjusted the rearview mirror to observe his son for a brief moment. "A special place, a place where you can feel nature up close." His response came with a studiedly neutral tone that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand on end. The violin in his hands was more than an instrument. It was the last tangible connection to his mother, Eleanor, who had disappeared exactly 3 months ago. Officially, she had left on a business trip and suffered a tragic accident. At least that was the story Arthur had told everyone, including his own son. But Ethan, with that heightened intuition that blindness seemed to have bestowed upon him as compensation, felt that there was much more to this story than he had been told. "We're almost there," Arthur announced, slowing down as the SUV left the paved road and turned onto a dirt track that descended towards the valley. What Ethan couldn't see but could feel perfectly was the subtle change in his father's behavior in recent weeks. The more distant tone of voice, the hesitant, almost reluctant touch, as if physical contact with his son caused him discomfort. And there were those late-night phone conversations when Arthur thought Ethan was asleep, talking about solving the problem and ensuring total control. The SUV stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain intensifying against the roof of the vehicle. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as the door next to him opened suddenly, allowing the cold mountain air to invade the warm interior of the car. "Come on, son, I have something special to show you." Arthur's voice sounded strangely dispassionate, as if he were reading a rehearsed script. A few yards away, in a rustic cabin partially hidden among ancient trees, Walter, an elderly man of 78 years old, prepared his fishing rod with the patience and precision acquired over decades dedicated to that craft. His fingers, gnarled but surprisingly agile, tied a handmade lure while his eyes, a deep brown that had witnessed more of life than most people, occasionally lifted to observe the river. Walter was not just a simple fisherman. In his youth, he had been a combat medic, saving lives in conflict zones around the world before seeking refuge in that remote corner of the mountains, fleeing painful memories and seeking the peace that only nature seemed capable of offering. Solitude had become his most constant companion since the death of his wife, Beatrice, 15 years ago. The only trace of her he kept was an old violin, carefully stored in a leather case worn by time. That morning, something troubled him. An unsettling, almost premonitory feeling that had made him postpone his trip to the river for a few hours. Now, finally decided to face the day, he adjusted his fishing hat, put on a waterproof jacket, and stepped out into the damp morning air, completely unaware that he was about to become the linchpin of a story that would forever change the lives of 3 people. On the opposite side of the river, Arthur guided Ethan along a narrow path to a small wooden pier where a simple boat was tied. The businessman observed his son with an indecipherable expression as he helped him into the boat. "Watch the steps, they're slippery," he warned mechanically, without the warmth that would normally accompany such concern. Ethan nodded, his face a mask of concentration as he moved with the habitual caution of those who live in darkness. He held the violin firmly against his chest with one hand, while the other felt the way ahead. "Can I bring my violin on the boat, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice betraying a growing nervousness. "Of course," Arthur replied dryly, helping his son settle on the bench of the small boat. "Hold on tight, the current is strong today." A truth that Arthur had not shared with anyone was that 3 weeks after Eleanor's disappearance, he had discovered the modification to the will. His wife, apparently anticipating danger, had transferred the entire family real estate empire, built predominantly with her family's money, to Ethan's name, with the condition that Arthur could only manage the businesses as his son's legal representative until he turned 21. For a man who had dedicated his life to the accumulation of power and wealth, who prided himself on controlling absolutely everything around him, the discovery was devastating. The idea of depending on the goodwill of a blind boy, his own son, whom he had always seen more as a disappointment than as an heir, was simply intolerable. As he rowed towards the center of the river, Arthur's gaze alternated between the turbulent current and his son's fragile figure. Each stroke of the oars seemed to take him deeper into a moral abyss from which he might never return. But, in his mind distorted by greed and power, he had convinced himself that he had no choice. "It's very loud here," Ethan commented, feeling the vibrations of the turbulent water through the hull of the boat. "The river sounds angry. Today." "Yes," replied Arthur, stopping rowing when they reached the point where the current was strongest. "Nature can sometimes be unforgiving." On the other side of the river, partially hidden by a rocky overhang, Walter had arrived at his favorite fishing spot just as the boat reached the middle of the river. His experienced eyes immediately noticed something strange about the scene, unfolding a few dozen yards away. The man in the boat seemed tense, restless, his movements lacking the natural fluidity of someone simply enjoying a leisurely row. What happened next was so fast that later, Walter would question if it hadn't been a hallucination. The man in the boat suddenly stood up and, with a deliberate movement, pushed the child out of the vessel. There was no hesitation, no accident. It was a calculated act of malice, and it sent a chill down Walter's spine. "Help, Dad, help!" Ethan's desperate cry cut through the air as he struggled against the icy water. The violin still clutched in one hand, while the other thrashed frantically at the surface. Arthur remained motionless in the boat, watching with a shocking coldness as his son was swept away by the fierce current. In his disturbed mind, he was already calculating how he would transform that atrocity into an accidental tragedy, how he would use his influence to silence any suspicion, how he would finally have unrestricted access to the fortune he considered rightfully his. What he hadn't counted on was Walter's presence, who without a moment's hesitation dropped his fishing rod and plunged into the freezing river with surprising agility for a man of his age. "Hold on tight, kid," Walter yelled, swimming with powerful strokes against the current as he watched the small body being dragged further and further away. For Ethan, the world had turned into a nightmare of deafening sounds, piercing cold, and absolute panic. The darkness that had always been his companion now seemed infinitely more threatening as the water pulled him down, stealing the air from his lungs. His fingers remained clenched around the violin, as if that piece of wood could somehow save him from the certain death that awaited him in the turbulent depths of the river. Ethan's last coherent thought before consciousness began to slip away was a painful question. "Why, Dad? Why did you do this to me?" Walter swam with fierce determination, each stroke a test for his aging muscles, strengthened by decades of hard work. The icy water seemed to cut his skin like 1,000 needles, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on the small figure struggling ever more weakly against the current a few yards ahead. "Hang in there, son. I'm coming," Walter shouted, his voice almost swallowed by the roar of the water. The old man realized with horror that the boy had stopped fighting. The small body now floated inertly, carried like a leaf by the relentless force of the river. With a last, superhuman effort, Walter managed to reach him, grabbing him firmly by his jacket. "I've got you, kid. You're going to be all right now," the old man murmured, more to himself than to the unconscious boy. With Ethan secure in one arm, Walter still noticed with surprise that the boy hadn't let go of the violin, holding it in a desperate grip even, in unconsciousness. Using all his experience and remaining strength, the old man began to swim diagonally against the current, seeking a point where he could reach the shore. Meanwhile, Arthur watched the scene from a distance with an expression that wavered between shock and cold calculation. He hadn't anticipated the presence of a witness, much less one who would have the courage and ability to intervene. For a brief moment, he considered rowing towards the two to help and ensure that neither of them survived to tell the story. But the sound of an engine in the distance, probably from approaching fishermen, made him reconsider. With quick and precise movements, Arthur rowed to the opposite bank, tied the boat, and ran to his SUV, his mind already formulating the narrative of the tragic accident he would tell the police and the media. After a struggle that seemed to last an eternity, Walter finally managed to drag Ethan onto a small, rocky cove. Laying the boy's still body on the smooth stones, the old man quickly checked his vital signs, his medical training resurfacing instantly. "Not breathing, weak pulse," he diagnosed aloud, immediately initiating resuscitation procedures. With precise movements, Walter applied chest compressions followed by mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, his eyes fixed on the boy's pale, motionless face. "Come on, kid. Fight. You still have so much to live for," he pleaded as he worked tirelessly to bring the boy back. After what seemed like an eternity, but was only a few minutes, Ethan suddenly coughed, expelling water as his lungs desperately fought for air. Walter quickly turned him onto his side, allowing the water to drain more easily. "That's right, son. Breathe, just breathe," he encouraged gently, feeling relief flood his own exhausted body. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, those blue eyes that didn't see but seemed to contain the entire ocean in their depths. Panic immediately gripped his face. "My violin! Where's my violin?" were his first words, his voice hoarse and failing. Walter looked around and saw the instrument lying a few feet away. Reaching for it, he gently placed it in the boy's hands. "It's here, kid. Safe, just like you." The relief on Ethan's face was immediate and profound. His trembling fingers caressed the instrument, checking for any damage. Who are you?" he finally asked, the confusion evident in his weak voice. "My name is Walter. I'm just an old fisherman who was in the right place at the right time," he replied simply. He hesitated before asking the question that burned in his chest. "Son, what happened back on the river? That man, he pushed you deliberately." Ethan's face contorted in an expression of pain that went far beyond the physical. "That was my father," he replied, his voice almost inaudible. Walter felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He had witnessed many atrocities during his years as a medic in conflict zones, but the idea of a father trying to kill his own son was something his aged heart could barely comprehend. "Your father," he repeated, the disbelief evident in his voice. Ethan nodded slowly, trembling violently now, both from the cold and the shock. He's changed since my mother disappeared. He thinks I don't know, but I heard the calls. About the money. About getting rid of me." Walter took off his waterproof jacket and wrapped it around the trembling boy, gently lifting him into his arms. "Let's get you to my cabin. You need warmth and rest. We can talk more when you've recovered." "I can't go back home," whispered Ethan, fear evident in every syllable. "I won't take you back to him," Walter promised firmly. "Not until we understand exactly what's happening and ensure your safety. You have my word." As he walked slowly along the path leading to his cabin, carrying the soaked boy and his precious violin, Walter felt the weight of the responsibility he had just undertaken. At the same time, a strange sense of purpose began to dawn in his heart, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his wife passed away. In the simple but cozy cabin, Walter quickly lit the fireplace and helped Ethan change out of his wet clothes into some old but dry and warm pieces that belonged to his grandson, who occasionally visited. While preparing herbal tea to warm the boy from the inside out, he watched Ethan carefully drying his violin with a soft cloth that the old man had offered him. "You play?" he asked gently, placing a steaming mug in the boy's hands. Ethan nodded, a small smile finding its way onto his still pale face. "It's the only thing I'm really good at. My mom said I had a gift." "She must have been right," Walter replied. "When you're feeling better, I'd very much like to hear you play." Meanwhile, a few miles away, Arthur Blackwood walked into the local police station, his face a perfect mask of despair and anguish. "My son!" he exclaimed to the first officer he saw, fake tears streaming down his face. "My son fell into the river. Please, we need a search and rescue team immediately." The officer, a young man named David, immediately called the sergeant. Within minutes, Arthur was recounting how his boat had accidentally capsized during an outing with his blind son, and how, despite his desperate efforts, the current had swept the boy away. "I tried to reach him. I swam until I had no strength left," he lied, his voice choked with manufactured grief. "But the current was too strong. Please, you have to find him. He's all I have left since my wife." He left the sentence unfinished, covering his face with his hands, in a display of pain that would have convinced even the most skeptical of observers. The sergeant, a middle-aged man named Miller, immediately mobilized a search and rescue team. "We'll do everything in our power to find your son, Mr. Blackwood," he assured, placing a comforting hand on the businessman's shoulder. "You're a very respected man in this area, and we all remember your generous donation for the police station renovation last year." Arthur nodded, satisfied to see that his strategic investments in local authority figures were yielding the expected dividends. As he accompanied the search team to the site of the accident, he carefully planned his next steps. The body would never be found. Of that he was certain, as he had chosen that specific stretch of the river precisely because of the strong current and the dangerous whirlpools that had supposedly claimed other lives over the years. Within a few days, the search would be officially called off and Ethan would be declared dead by drowning. With the death certificate in hand, Arthur would finally have unrestricted access to the fortune he considered rightfully his. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, his son was sitting in front of a cozy fireplace, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, slowly beginning to tell his story to an old fisherman who had already decided, without explicitly admitting it, that he would do anything to protect that boy. "My mom disappeared 3 months ago," Ethan began, his voice small but steady. "At least that's what my dad tells everyone. She supposedly had an accident during a business trip. But you don't believe that," Walter completed gently. Sensing the boy's hesitation, Ethan shook his head. "She called me the night before she disappeared. She said she had found out something terrible and that she needed to hide for a while. She said she had arranged everything to protect me, and that no matter what happened, I should trust my heart and never forget that she loved me more than anything." A solitary tear rolled down the boy's cheek. "The next morning, my dad said she had left on her trip. A week later, he announced that she had died in an accident, but I knew something was wrong." Walter felt his heart clench. The story was becoming darker with each passing moment, surpassing his initial worst fears. "Ethan," he said gently, using the name the boy had given him during their conversation, "I think we need to keep you hidden for now. Your father is certainly looking for you, probably claiming it was an accident. He'll tell everyone I'm just a fragile blind kid who didn't stand a chance against the river." Ethan agreed, a painful wisdom in his voice. "And everyone will believe him. He's Arthur Blackwood, after all, the big businessman, the philanthropist, the man who built half the city." Recognition struck Walter like a lightning bolt. Of course, he knew Arthur Blackwood, at least by reputation. Who didn't? The real estate magnate whose face frequently graced the local newspapers, inaugurating new developments or making seemingly generous donations to community causes. A man whose influence extended from local politicians to the region's police force. "We're dealing with someone powerful," Walter murmured, more to himself than to Ethan. "But that doesn't change anything. You're safe here, and we'll figure out a way to expose the truth. Ethan nodded, exhausted, his eyes beginning to close against his will. Walter realized the boy was at the end of his strength. "Rest now," he said gently, helping him lie down on the small couch near the fireplace. "We'll think about what to do tomorrow." Covering the boy with a thick wool blanket, Walter watched as Ethan quickly succumbed to sleep, still clutching his violin as if it were a talisman against the evil that had entered his young life. Sitting in his old armchair, watching the boy sleep while the flames danced in the fireplace, Walter reflected on the strange paths of fate. After years of self-imposed solitude, he suddenly found himself the guardian of a boy who desperately needed protection. A boy whose father was one of the most powerful and apparently most dangerous men in the region. "What have you gotten yourself into this time, you old fool?" he whispered to himself, a mixture of worry and determination in his tired eyes. But deep down, Walter knew he had no choice. Fate had placed Ethan in his path for a reason, and he wouldn't turn his back on an innocent in danger. Not again, he had promised himself years ago, after failing to save so many during his years as a medic in war zones. "This time will be different," he vowed silently, looking at the boy's sleeping face. "This time I won't fail." Outside, the rain continued to fall, muffling the sound of the search teams that were beginning to spread out along the riverbanks, looking for a body they would never find. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the faded curtains of the cabin, casting a golden glow on Ethan's sleeping face. Walter, who had spent much of the night keeping watch, observed the boy with a mixture of concern and admiration. Despite everything he had faced, the boy slept with a serene expression, his fingers still lightly intertwined with the strings of the violin that rested beside him. The old man quietly rose from his armchair, where he had dozed intermittently, and headed to the small kitchen to prepare a substantial breakfast. As he cracked eggs into a bowl, his thoughts wandered between plans and possibilities. The situation was dangerous, of that he had no doubt. Arthur Blackwood was not only rich and powerful, he was a man willing to kill his own son for money. Such a man would certainly not hesitate to eliminate a meddling old fisherman. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and scrambled eggs soon filled the cabin, provoking a slight movement on the couch. Ethan sat up slowly, his face showing momentary confusion until the events of the previous day returned to his memory. "Good morning," Walter said gently, approaching. "How are you feeling?" Ethan turned his head in the direction of the voice, his unfocused eyes instinctively seeking the source of the sound. "A little sore, but alive thanks to you." "Walter, just Walter," the old man corrected with an audible smile in his voice. "I've made breakfast. We need to get your strength back." As he helped Ethan sit at the small wooden table, Walter noted with growing admiration how quickly the boy adapted to the unfamiliar environment. His sensitive fingers discreetly explored the space around him, creating a mental map of the furniture and objects. "Your father must be organizing searches all along the river," Walter commented, placing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of the boy. "We need to be careful. This cabin is isolated, but I occasionally get visitors, fishermen mostly." Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He won't give up easily, not when there's so much money involved. "What do you mean?" Walter asked, sitting down at the table with his own meal. Between hesitant bites, Ethan explained about his mother's modified will, about how the entire fortune had been transferred to his name, with Arthur serving only as legal administrator until he came of age. "That explains a lot," Walter murmured, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his mind. "Your mother must have suspected something. She was trying to protect you, and ended up becoming a target," Ethan finished, his voice choked. "I'm almost certain it was him, that he did something to her." Walter reached across the table, covering Ethan's small hand with his own, wrinkled but strong. "We can't prove anything yet, but I promise we'll find out the truth. For now, we need to ensure your safety." "How are we going to do that?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. "He's Arthur Blackwood. Everyone in the region either works for him or owes him favors or is afraid of him." Walter pondered for a moment. "It's true he has influence, but this mountain town has its own unwritten rules. Many families here are descended from people who fled oppressive regimes in their homelands. There's a code of honor among the older residents. Protect the vulnerable against the powerful. But for that, we'd need to tell someone the truth, Ethan considered. And who would believe the word of a blind boy and an old fisherman against one of the most powerful men in the region? Maybe we don't need them to believe yet, Walter replied, an idea forming in his mind. For now, we just need you to remain missing while we plan our next steps. At that very moment, a few miles away, the search and rescue teams concentrated their efforts on a particularly dangerous stretch of the river, known locally as the Gorge, a narrow passage between rocks where the water rushed with brutal force, creating treacherous whirlpools. Arthur Blackwood, dressed in casual but visibly expensive clothes, presented the perfect image of a devastated father. Carefully cultivated dark circles under his eyes, unshaven, the empty gaze of someone who has lost everything, a performance worthy of a veteran actor. "Any sign of him?" he asked Sergeant Miller, his voice purposefully trembling. The sergeant shook his head gravely. "Nothing yet, Mr. Blackwood, but we haven't lost hope. We have divers checking the deeper areas." Arthur nodded, allowing his eyes to fill with manufactured tears. "He was all I had left since I lost my wife. I don't know how I'll go on without him." The sergeant placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know it must seem impossible, but try to hold on to hope. Miracles happen." "Yes," Arthur agreed, thinking ironically that the real miracle would be if Ethan's body was never found, as he had planned. "I'll try." Back at the cabin, Ethan had finished his breakfast and was now carefully exploring the surroundings, his sensitive fingers building a mental image of the space. "Your house is cozy," he commented, touching the various objects he encountered. On his way, worn books, fishing tools, simple household utensils. Suddenly his fingers found a familiar object that made him stop. "Is this a violin case?" Walter, who had been watching the boy with interest, smiled. "Yes, it belonged to my wife, Beatrice. She was a talented musician, a music teacher actually, before we retired and came to these mountains." Ethan's fingers caressed the leather case with reverence. Can I see the instrument?" "Of course," Walter replied, moving closer to help open the case. Ethan's face lit up as he touched the old violin, his fingers expertly exploring every curve, every detail of the instrument. "It's a Guarneri," he murmured, impressed. "Maybe not original, but a great copy. It must be over 70 years old." Walter looked at the boy in surprise. "How do you know that?" "I can feel it from the shape, the texture of the wood," Ethan explained, a small smile appearing on his face for the first time since the rescue. "My mum taught me to recognize different violins by touch. She said my fingers could see what my eyes couldn't." "Your mother sounds like she was an extraordinary woman," Walter commented. "She was," Ethan agreed, longing evident in his voice. His fingers found the strings of the instrument. "It's out of tune, may I?" Walter nodded, then remembering Ethan couldn't see the gesture, replied, "Be my guest." "No one has played this violin in 15 years, not since Beatrice passed." With a skill that surprised Walter, Ethan quickly tuned the instrument, his ears catching nuances that would escape most people. Then, without warning, he began to play. The melody that emerged from the old violin was breathtakingly beautiful, sad, profound, but also strangely hopeful. The notes flowed through Ethan's fingers, as if they were extensions of his own soul, filling the confined space of the cabin with a musical expression that spoke of loss, pain, and yet an unwavering resilience. Walter felt involuntary tears form in his eyes. There was something in the way Ethan played that reminded him of Beatrice, not the technique itself, but the pure emotion he managed to extract from the instrument. When the last note faded into the air, a reverent silence filled the cabin. "That was extraordinary," Walter finally said, his voice husky with emotion. Ethan lowered the violin, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. "It's a composition by my mother. She wrote it for me when I was 6. Before Walter could respond, a noise from outside the cabin made them both immediately alert. "Someone's coming," Walter whispered, moving quickly to the window. His expression relaxed as he recognized the visitor. "It's just Pete, my closest neighbor. Lives about half a mile from here, a good man." "He'll see me," Ethan whispered, panic evident in his voice. Walter thought quickly. Go to the back bedroom, close the door, don't make a sound. As Ethan hastily felt his way to the indicated room, Walter composed his expression and went to answer the door. Pete, a robust man in his early 60s with a sun-weathered face and kind eyes, smiled when he saw Walter. Morning, old friend. Brought that joint pain remedy you asked for last week. Much obliged, Pete, Walter replied, trying to sound casual as he accepted the small jar. You're always thoughtful. Pete tilted his head, observing Walter with curiosity. You all right? You seem tense. I'm fine, Walter assured him, perhaps too quickly. Just didn't sleep too well last night. Heard they're doing a massive search on the river, Pete commented. Apparently Arthur Blackwood's kid fell out of a boat yesterday. Everyone's looking for him, poor little guy. Blind kid, they say. What a tragedy, Walter murmured, feeling uncomfortable with the lie, but knowing it was necessary. I hope they find him, Pete sighed. They say the chances are next to zero. The current was strong yesterday, and that stretch of the river is treacherous. A real shame. First the mother, now the son. The man seems cursed by tragedy. Yes, a real shame, Walter agreed, avoiding Pete's gaze. After a few minutes of conversation about trivial matters, the weather, the fishing, local news, Pete finally said goodbye. Gotta run. My wife's waiting for us to head to the music festival this afternoon. You should come too, Walt. Do you good to get out of this cabin for a bit? The music festival. Walter had completely forgotten. Every year, the small mountain town held a festival that attracted musicians from all over the region. A sudden idea began to form in his mind. Maybe I will, he replied, a nascent plan giving a different glint to his eyes. As soon as Pete was out of sight, Walter quickly returned inside the cabin. Ethan hesitantly emerged from the bedroom. Is he gone? The boy asked. Yes, Walter confirmed, and he gave me an idea. The annual music festival starts today. People from all over the region will be there, including maybe someone who can help us. Ethan looked confused. But how can I go out? Everyone's looking for me. Walter smiled, a new energy in his movements. Not everyone knows exactly what you look like, and with a few simple modifications, a baseball cap to cover your hair, maybe some dark glasses. Besides, who would look for Arthur Blackwood's dead son at a music festival, playing the violin in front of hundreds of people? It's too risky, Ethan hesitated. Sometimes the safest place is in plain sight, Walter replied. Besides, your musical talent is extraordinary. People like that don't go unnoticed. There might be someone there, a teacher, a professional, musician, who can help us build a future for you away from your father. For the first time since the rescue, a spark of hope lit up Ethan's face. You really think I could have a future after all this? Walter placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm sure of it. Your music has already won over this old heart. I can only imagine what it can do to the rest of the world. In the town's main square, preparations for the music festival were almost complete. Small stages had been set up, food, stalls exuded tempting aromas, and musicians of all ages tuned their instruments, preparing for the performances that would begin in a few hours. Among the arriving visitors, an elegant woman in her early 40s stepped out of a taxi, her dark eyes carefully observing the festive scene. Catherine Blackwood, Arthur's sister, had hastily traveled to the region as soon as she heard about the tragic accident involving her nephew. Unlike her brother, Catherine had always been affectionate with Ethan, recognizing and encouraging his musical talent from an early age. And more importantly, she had never fully trusted Arthur, especially after Eleanor's sudden disappearance. The festival starts at 2, the taxi driver informed her as he took her suitcase from the trunk. Catherine nodded, her gaze wandering through the crowd as if subconsciously searching for someone. Thank you. What no one knew, not even Ethan, was that Catherine had been Eleanor's only confidant in the last months of her life, and she carried a secret that could change everything, a secret she had sworn to reveal only when it was absolutely safe to do so. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Walter and Ethan finalized their preparations for their risky appearance at the festival. The old man had found a worn baseball cap and sunglasses that belonged to his grandson, and Ethan now looked different enough from the description circulating the region. The poor blind boy with light brown hair who fell into the river. Remember, Walter instructed as they walked carefully along the path leading to the town. "If anyone asks, you're my grandson Gabe, visiting from the southern mountains. You lost your sight in an accident 2 years ago, and you're here to participate in the festival." "Gabe," Ethan repeated, memorizing his persona. "From the southern mountains, blind for 2 years. Got it." Walter smiled, impressed by the boy's composure. "You're incredibly brave, you know that?" Ethan clutched the violin to his chest. "It's not bravery, it's survival. My mom always said we should face our fears, not run from them." "Your mother was a wise woman," Walter commented. What neither of them knew was that, at that very moment, their destinies were about to intertwine, with Catherine's in a way that would permanently change the course of their lives. The festival buzzed with activity when Walter and Ethan arrived at the town square. Music, laughter, and the aroma of homemade food filled the air, creating a festive atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the tension they both felt. To the casual observer, they looked like just a grandfather and his grandson enjoying a day of celebration, but their hearts beat faster with the risk they were taking. "There are so many people," Ethan whispered, holding tightly to Walter's arm as his ears tried to process the cacophony of sounds around them. "That's good for us," Walter replied, carefully guiding him through the crowd. "Easier to go unnoticed." Ethan, with the baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and the sunglasses completing his disguise, concentrated intently on his other senses. The smell of freshly baked bread to his right, the sound of a violin being tuned to his left, the warmth of the autumn sun on his face, each sensation helped him build a mental map of the environment. "The sign-ups for performances are happening near the big oak tree," Walter explained. "I can see a small line. Shall we sign you up for the youth category?" Ethan hesitated briefly, fear momentarily overcoming his determination. "What if someone recognizes me by the way I play? My mum always said every musician has their unique signature." Walter stopped, turning to face the boy. "Listen, Gabe," he said, deliberately using the fake name so Ethan would get used to it. "There's a risk, yes, but there's also an opportunity. Your music might be the way we find help. Trust me." After a moment of reflection, Ethan nodded. "Let's do it." As they headed towards the registration table, neither of them noticed the elegant woman who was attentively observing the crowd, Catherine Blackwood, whose presence in town was unknown even to her brother. At the registration table, a young volunteer smiled as she saw them approach. "Hi there, here to sign up?" "Yes," Walter replied, his voice deliberately casual. "My grandson Gabe would like to participate in the youth category." The young woman looked sympathetically at Ethan, noticing the sunglasses. "First time at the festival?" she asked gently. Ethan simply nodded, afraid that his voice might betray his true identity. "He's a little shy," Walter explained, "but he plays beautifully." "I'm sure he does," smiled the volunteer, filling out the form. "Full name?" "Gabe Oliveira," Walter replied, using his late wife's maiden name. "Age?" 12. "Instrument?" "Violin." "Piece you'll be performing?" Walter looked at Ethan, realizing they hadn't discussed this detail. "Original composition," Ethan interjected, his voice low but steady. "It's called Rebirth." Walter raised, his eyebrows surprised by the quick response and the meaningful title the boy had chosen. "Wonderful," exclaimed the volunteer, completing the registration. "You're in Group 3, which performs in approximately 2 hours on the stage near the lake. Good luck, Gabe." Moving away from the table, Walter guided Ethan to a bench under a large tree, a relatively quiet spot amidst the bustle. "Rebirth?" he asked with curiosity. A small smile formed on Ethan's lips. "I've been composing it in my head since I woke up this morning. It'll be a mix of my mother's lullaby with some melodies I heard you humming while you made breakfast." Walter's heart tightened. The boy's resilience, his ability to transform trauma into art, was simply extraordinary. "I'm sure it will be beautiful," he said, his voice slightly choked. While they waited, Walter bought snacks for both of them from a nearby stall. Ethan was savoring a pastry when he suddenly stiffened. "What is it?" Walter asked, immediately alert. "That perfume," Ethan whispered, his face turning slightly in the direction of a woman walking past them. It's my Aunt Catherine's perfume." Walter followed the boy's blind gaze and saw an elegant woman, her dark hair styled in a sophisticated bun, standing a few yards away. "Your aunt is here?" he asked quietly, concern evident in his voice. "Is she trustworthy?" Ethan remained, still for a moment as if pondering the question. "She was always good to me, and she never got along with my father, but I don't know if we can trust her with something this big." "Let's observe her for now," Walter decided. "If she's here, it could be a coincidence, or she didn't believe the accident story," Ethan finished. Meanwhile, Catherine continued her search of the square, her eyes scanning every face. Something about the accident that had befallen her nephew didn't add up. Arthur had always shown more irritation than affection towards Ethan, especially after Eleanor's will was changed. And the way he had dramatically organized the search, conveniently directing teams to the most dangerous part of the river, seemed strangely calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen, the festival is officially open," announced an amplified voice from the main stage. "Our first performances will begin in 10 minutes. The crowd moved towards the various stages, and Walter used the opportunity to steer Ethan discreetly away from the area where Catherine was. They needed time to decide if approaching her would be safe. Over the next 2 hours, Ethan and Walter watched several performances, the boy absorbing every musical note with his extraordinarily sensitive hearing. Occasionally, his fingers moved slightly, as if playing an imaginary violin, mentally refining the piece he would perform. "Group 3, get ready, you're up next," called an organizer passing by them. Ethan took a deep breath, clutching his violin tighter. "I'm ready," Walter smiled, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You'll shine out there, Gabe." As they walked towards the preparation area, Walter noted with alarm that Catherine had moved closer to the stage where Ethan would perform. She seemed particularly interested in the program, intently examining the list of participants. "She's near the stage," he whispered to Ethan. The boy swallowed hard but remained steady. "Maybe it's time we found out if she's friend or foe." Moments later, Ethan was led to the center of the small stage. The audience, composed mainly of locals and a few tourists, applauded politely. In the corner of the audience, Catherine glanced absently at the young violinist, her interest momentarily casual. "And now, we have Gabe Oliveira, 12 years old. They're performing an original composition entitled Rebirth," announced the presenter. An expectant silence fell over the crowd. Ethan raised his violin, positioning it with the precision of an experienced musician. His fingers found the strings and he began to play. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like the first rays of sun after a long night. Gradually, the melody gained complexity and depth, weaving the theme of the lullaby his mother had composed with new elements that spoke of loss, fear, and, surprisingly, hope. In the audience, Catherine initially listened with the polite appreciation of someone who enjoys music, but as the melody developed, her posture changed. She straightened up, her eyes fixed on the young violinist, an expression of growing shock taking over her face. Walter, watching from the side of the stage, noticed the change. He saw the exact moment recognition dawned on Catherine, when she brought her hand to her mouth and took an involuntary step towards the stage. She recognized the lullaby. She recognized Ethan's unique style, even with the evolution the piece demonstrated. And most importantly, she recognized that the Gabe on stage was, in fact, her supposedly drowned nephew. The music continued, reaching an emotional climax that left several spectators with tears in their eyes. When the last note faded into the air, there was a moment of reverent silence before the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Ethan gave a small bow towards the applause, a shy smile lighting up his face. Walter hurried to help him off, the stage aware that Catherine was now moving purposefully in their direction. "She's coming," he warned quietly. "Follow my lead." "Gabe!" Catherine called, her voice controlled but urgent as she reached them. "What an extraordinary performance." Ethan turned in the direction of the voice, his body tense. "Thank you, Mom," he replied cautiously. Catherine glanced quickly around before lowering her voice. "Can we talk privately? About Your music. It's extraordinarily similar to a composition my dear friend Eleanor created. Walter interjected, protective. My grandson is tired after his performance, perhaps another time. Please, Catherine insisted, her eyes pleading. It's important, I promise I mean no harm, quite the opposite. Something in the sincerity of her voice made Ethan lightly touch Walter's arm. It's all right. We can hear her. Reluctantly, Walter agreed, leading them to a more secluded spot, a small garden behind the local church away from the festival crowd. As soon as they were sure no one could overhear them, Catherine spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan, it is you, isn't it? How is this possible? Everyone believes you. Died? Ethan finished, removing his sunglasses to reveal his unmistakable blue eyes. That was my father's plan. In a few broken sentences, he and Walter explained the events of the previous day, how Arthur had deliberately pushed his son into the river, how Walter had witnessed everything and risked his own life to save the boy. Tears ran freely down Catherine's face. I knew it, she whispered. Deep down, I knew he was capable of something like this. Ever since your mother. Ethan leaned forward, his posture tense. My mother, what? What really happened to her? Catherine took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. Ethan, your mother didn't disappear or die in an accident like your father claimed. She discovered illicit dealings your father had been conducting, money laundering, bribing public officials to approve real estate projects in protected areas. She was collecting evidence, documents, recordings, and then he did something to her, Ethan stated, his voice strangely calm. I can't prove it, Catherine admitted, but 3 days before her disappearance, Eleanor came to me. She gave me a sealed letter to be opened only if something happened to her. She also told me she had modified her will, transferring everything to you, and that she had left specific instructions with her trusted lawyer. Walter looked at the woman with growing hope. You have this letter? Catherine nodded. It's locked in a safe deposit box, and I know who the lawyer is who has the detailed instructions. Eleanor created a safety net for Ethan, anticipating that Arthur would eventually become a threat. But she couldn't protect herself, Walter observed sadly. She knew the risks, Catherine replied, gently touching Ethan's face, but she believed it was worth it to protect her son. Ethan remained silent for a long moment, processing the revelations. Finally, he spoke. What do we do now? First, we need to keep you safe, Catherine declared with determination. Arthur can't know you're alive yet, not until we have enough evidence against him. He believes he achieved his goal, Walter agreed. That's our advantage. The search for the body will officially be suspended in 2 days, Catherine informed them. I've already heard Arthur grieving in interviews that they may never be able to give his son a proper burial. He's building his narrative of the bereaved father carefully. Ethan shuddered at the calculated cynicism of his father. Meanwhile, Catherine continued, I'll contact your mother's lawyer, retrieve the letter from the safe deposit box, gather all the evidence we can against Arthur. We'll need to build a solid case before revealing you're alive. You and Ethan can stay at my cabin for now, Walter offered. It's isolated and safe. Catherine agreed. That's the best plan for the time being. I'll keep in touch using a burner phone to prevent Arthur from tracking my communications. He's paranoid about that sort of thing. As they discussed the details of their improvised plan, none of them noticed the figure casually walking by on the other side of the garden wall, David, the young police officer who had received Arthur, at the station the day before. He had recognized Catherine from the local news and, curious about what the businessman's sister was doing in such a private conversation, had moved close enough to hear unsettling fragments of their talk. David walked away thoughtfully, his sense of justice clashing with his professional loyalty. Sergeant Miller was admittedly close to Arthur Blackwood. The police station renovation had been just one of the many gifts the businessman had offered local authorities over the years. If he shared what he had just heard with his superior, the information would certainly reach Arthur's ears within hours. On the other hand, the idea that a man had tried to kill his own son, a blind boy no less, was so repugnant that David couldn't simply ignore it. Back in the garden, the three conspirators finalized their immediate plan. "I'll call you tomorrow using the code we agreed on," Catherine said, hugging her nephew tightly. "Stay safe, Ethan. Your mother moved mountains to protect you, and I'll do the same." Ethan nodded, allowing himself for the first time since the incident on the river to shed a few tears. "Thank you, Aunt Catherine, for believing me." "Always," she promised, wiping away her own tears. "Now go before anyone notices our prolonged conversation." As Walter guided Ethan discreetly back towards the festival grounds, preparing to return to the relative safety of the cabin in the mountains, neither of them could foresee the events that would unfold in the next few hours. Events that would test their courage, loyalty, and determination like never before. In his luxurious condo downtown, Arthur Blackwood watched the local news, satisfied with the coverage of his despair. During the search for his son, his phone rang. It was Sergeant Miller. "Any news?" Arthur asked, his tone carefully modulated to convey anxious hope. "None, unfortunately," the sergeant replied. "But there's something you should know. Your sister, Catherine, is in town. She was seen at the music festival this afternoon." Arthur frowned, an uneasy feeling beginning to churn in his stomach. Catherine had always been too close to Eleanor and Ethan, and always suspiciously perceptive. "Interesting," he replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Thanks for letting me know, Sergeant. I'll get in touch with her." Hanging up, Arthur remained still for a few moments, his calculating mind assessing possibilities and risks. Catherine on the scene was a complication he hadn't anticipated, a complication that would need to be carefully monitored or eliminated. Night fell over the mountains, bringing with it a silence that seemed to amplify the troubled thoughts within Walter's cabin. The old man had lit the fireplace, its crackling fire casting dancing shadows on the rustic walls, creating a contrast of light and darkness that perfectly reflected their current situation, a fragile balance between hope and danger. Ethan sat near the fire, his fingers gliding gently over the strings of the violin without producing sound, an exercise his mother had taught him to calm his nerves. His young face, illuminated by the orange glow of the flames, wore an expression of concentration that made him look much older than his 12 years. "You did very well today," Walter commented, placing a mug of hot cocoa in the boy's hands. "Your performance, I've never seen anything like it." Ethan smiled slightly, accepting the drink. "Thank you for giving me courage, and for believing in me." "It was a risk worth taking," Walter replied, settling into his worn armchair. "Finding your aunt has changed everything. Now we have allies, a plan, but it's also increased the danger," Ethan observed with a wisdom beyond his years. "If my father finds out she's found us, that I'm alive." Walter nodded gravely, unable to disagree. "That's why we need to be even more careful, at least until we have all the evidence your aunt mentioned." "What do you think my mom left in that letter?" Ethan asked, his voice small, almost vulnerable. "Do you think that she knew what might happen to her?" Walter considered the question carefully. "I think your mother was an extraordinarily intelligent and perceptive woman. She saw the signs of danger and acted to protect what she loved. First you." Ethan was silent for a long moment, absorbing the words. When he spoke again, his voice held a peculiar mix of sadness and determination. Sometimes I have a hard time understanding how my own father could do this. Try to kill me. Some people get so completely lost in greed and power that they forget what really matters," Walter replied gently. "Your father made terrible choices, unforgivable choices, but that doesn't reflect on you, Ethan. Never forget that." The boy nodded, although the pain on his face revealed the depth of the wound Arthur's actions had left on his soul. A few miles away, in a small motel in town, Catherine Blackwood gazed at the night landscape through her hotel room window, her personal cell phone turned off on the bed to avoid tracking. In her hand, a burner phone she had bought that afternoon after leaving Ethan and Walter. With slightly trembling fingers, she dialed a number she knew by heart. "Mr. Caldwell," she said when a deep voice answered. "It's Catherine Blackwood." "Catherine," the voice replied, clearly surprised. "I wasn't expecting your call so late." "We need to meet," she stated, getting straight to the point. "It's about the matter Eleanor entrusted to you. The moment she mentioned has arrived." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "I understand," the lawyer finally replied, his tone now somber. "Where and when?" "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., at the coffee shop in the Natural History Museum downtown. It's discreet and public at the same time." "I'll be there," Mr. Caldwell promised. "And Catherine, be careful." Be careful? If what Eleanor suspected is true. "I know," she cut in, glancing nervously out the window. "Believe me, I know." Hanging up, Catherine didn't notice the dark car parked discreetly across the street, nor the man watching the motel with night vision binoculars. Inside the vehicle, a private investigator hastily hired by Arthur meticulously recorded the time of the call and the movement visible through the illuminated window. His employer had been clear. He wanted to know exactly what his sister was doing in town, who she was contacting, and especially if there was anything suspicious about her activities. In his luxurious office downtown, Arthur Blackwood examined the online news reports covering his son's tragic accident. The narrative was unfolding exactly as he had planned. Emotional news reports about the successful businessman who, having already lost his wife mysteriously, now faced the loss of his only son. Some publications even speculated about the curse that seemed to haunt the Blackwood family, which only increased the aura of sympathy around Arthur. His phone vibrated, a text message from the investigator. "Target made call using unregistered phone? 2-min duration appears apprehensive," Arthur frowned. An unregistered phone? Why would Catherine use a different phone than her usual one unless she was trying to hide something? His thoughts were interrupted by another call. It was Sergeant Miller again. "Mr. Blackwood, sorry to bother you so late," the sergeant began, in his usual subservient tone. "No problem, Sergeant. I'm not sleeping well anyway," Arthur replied, maintaining his facade of a grieving father. "Understandable, sir. It's about the search. Officially, we'll continue tomorrow. But the truth is our teams have lost hope. That stretch of the river has claimed other lives before and—" "I understand," Arthur interrupted, letting his voice crack strategically. "Just don't give up yet, please. A father needs to have hope no matter how small." "Of course, sir. We'll continue until the end of the week, as promised." "Thank you, Sergeant," Arthur said, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction after hanging up. Everything was going according to plan. In a few days, Ethan would be officially declared dead, which would allow Arthur to begin the process of assuming full control of the fortune. The search teams were focused exactly where he wanted, far from the actual location of the incident. The community's sympathies were with him. The press painted him as a tragic figure. The only unsettling variable was Catherine. His sister had always been too close to Eleanor, always looked at him with those suspicious eyes. Making a decision, Arthur typed another message to the investigator. "Follow her 24/7. I want to know every move, every contact, especially tomorrow." In the early hours of the next morning, as the first rays of sun began to color the horizon, David, the young police officer, walked nervously along the riverbank, away from the official search teams. What he had heard the day before in the garden behind the church had given him no rest. If what those people had said was true, if Arthur Blackwood had really tried to kill his own son, then he, as a law enforcement officer, couldn't simply ignore it. But going against a man with Blackwood's power and influence, especially when the sergeant himself seemed to be in his pocket, was potentially suicidal for his career. Or worse. As he pondered his moral dilemma, David spotted something unusual. On the rocky bank, marks that looked like they had been made by someone dragging something heavy out of the water. Crouching down to examine them more closely, he found a small gold button half buried among the rocks. A button that looked like it had been torn off an expensive piece of clothing. David picked up the button, a small but potentially significant piece of evidence. If someone had really rescued a boy from the river that day, they might have left tracks. Following his instinct, he began to examine the area more closely, looking for any sign that could corroborate the story he had overheard. About 50 feet upstream, he found footprints partially washed away by the rain, but still recognizable. Large footprints, probably from an adult male, and next to them, smaller marks, as if something or someone, had been dragged. The marks led to an almost invisible trail that went away from the river into the dense vegetation. His heart raced. He had chosen his side, the side of truth, no matter the consequences. At the cabin, Walter woke up early, his old fisherman, habits making him an early riser, even in the most stressful circumstances. He found Ethan already awake, sitting on the small porch, his face turned towards the rising sun. "I smelled the dawn," the boy explained when he heard the old man's footsteps. "My mom taught me how to recognize it. The air feels different, cleaner somehow." Walter smiled, sitting down beside him. "Your mother was a very wise woman. She used to say that when you can't see the world, you have to learn to feel it more deeply," Ethan continued. "I think I'm starting to understand what she meant." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts, until the sound of footsteps approaching rapidly along the trail alerted Walter. "Someone's coming," he whispered, standing up. "Quick, inside." But before they could move, a voice called out, "Mr. Walter, I need to talk to you, it's urgent." Walter frowned, recognizing the young man who now emerged from the trail, the police officer who occasionally patrolled the area. "David, what brings you here so early?" The young officer stopped a few feet away, his gaze alternating between Walter and Ethan. "I overheard a conversation yesterday, in the garden behind the church." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I know who this boy is, and I know what his father did." Walter immediately positioned himself protectively in front of Ethan, his posture tense. "And what do you intend to do with that information, young man?" David raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I came to help. What I heard of what Arthur Blackwood did, I can't stand by while a crime like that goes unpunished." Ethan, unable to see the newcomer but able to hear the sincerity in his voice, gently touched Walter's arm. "I think he's telling the truth." Reluctantly, Walter nodded, gesturing for David to come inside the cabin. Inside, away from potentially hostile eyes or ears, the young police officer recounted what he had discovered that morning. The marks on the riverbank, the button, the partially preserved footprints. "This could be physical evidence that backs up your testimony." "Not much, but it's a start. Why are you helping us?" "You work for Sergeant Miller, who's practically Arthur's employee." David sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "I joined the force to make a difference, to defend those who need protection, not to be an accomplice to a man who tries to kill his own son." Ethan, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "You seem sincere, but you need to understand the risk. My father isn't just powerful, he's ruthless. If he finds out you're helping us..." "I know the risks," David stated firmly, "but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do what's right." The three discussed the situation in detail, David providing valuable information about the official progress of the search and, more importantly, about Arthur's movements. "He comes to town every day to oversee the search personally," the officer reported. "It's pure theater, of course. He arrives, makes sure he's seen looking devastated, gives emotional statements to the local press, and then heads back to the city. Maintaining his image as the heartbroken father," Walter concluded with distaste. "Exactly. And it works. Everyone in town is moved by his suffering." Ethan shook his head, his unfocused eyes reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. "He was always good at manipulating people. My mom used to say he could sell ice to an Eskimo." The conversation was interrupted by the ring of the burner phone Catherine had left with them. Walter answered quickly. "I'm on my way," Catherine's voice said without preamble. "I have important news. I'll be there in an hour." "We have company," Walter replied, glancing at David, an unexpected ally from the local police. There was a tense pause. "Are you sure it's safe?" "I believe so. He found physical evidence that backs up our story." "I understand," Catherine replied, sounding slightly relieved. "Anyway, I have something that will change everything. Eleanor's letter and more, much more." Hanging up, Walter explained to the others about Catherine's imminent arrival. David offered to check if she wasn't being followed, a precaution they agreed was sensible, given Arthur's well-founded paranoia. Meanwhile, downtown, Arthur Blackwood received a call from his private investigator. Target left the motel early, sir. Drove to a coffee shop near the Natural History Museum. Met with an older formal man carrying a briefcase. They exchanged documents. I got photos from a distance. Send them to me immediately, Arthur ordered, growing irritation in his voice. When the images arrived on his cell phone, Arthur felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The man his sister had met with was no stranger. It was Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor's personal lawyer. Follow her, Arthur ordered the investigator, his voice now ice-cold, and find out where she goes next. Arthur hung up, his calculating mind rapidly processing this new information. Eleanor's lawyer, documents being exchanged, Catherine's mysterious presence in town just as his son had disappeared. The pieces were starting to fit together, and the picture they formed was extremely troubling. He needed to act, quickly and decisively. Standing up, he grabbed the keys to his sports car. It was time for a surprise visit to the mountain town. Back at the cabin, Ethan practiced a new melody on his violin while they waited. The music, different from the emotionally charged performance of the day before, was curiously peaceful, almost hopeful. "It's beautiful," David commented, genuinely impressed. "I've never heard anything like it." Ethan smiled slightly. "I'm calling it emerging truth. It's about secrets finally coming to light." Walter, who was watching out the window, suddenly became alert. "Someone's coming up the trail." David immediately reached for the gun in his holster, positioning himself strategically. "Can you see who it is?" "It's Catherine," Walter confirmed, visibly relaxing, "and it looks like she's alone." When Catherine entered the cabin, her face showed a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. In her hands, she carried a thick folder and a flash drive. "I got it," she announced, hugging Ethan tightly before greeting the others. "I have everything. Eleanor's letter, the documents she gathered about Arthur's illegal dealings, recordings she secretly made of incriminating conversations, bank statements from offshore accounts, and most importantly," she pulled an envelope from the folder, her hand trembling slightly. "The autopsy report that Eleanor secretly commissioned after her supposed accident. An independent doctor examined the body before the rushed burial Arthur arranged. And he found clear evidence of poisoning by an almost undetectable substance, one that causes symptoms easily mistaken for a heart attack." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. The confirmation of what they had all suspected, but feared to admit, was devastating, especially for Ethan, who visibly paled. He really killed my mother," the boy whispered, his voice almost inaudible. Catherine knelt before her nephew, taking his hands. "Yes, honey, but she knew the risks, and she prepared everything to protect you, and to make sure he would eventually pay." Eleanor was much smarter than Arthur ever imagined. David quickly examined the documents, his police training allowing him to quickly assess their value as evidence. This is incredible. This is solid proof, not only of the attempted murder against Ethan, but also of Eleanor's murder and a series of financial crimes. Enough to put Arthur Blackwood away for decades. "And there's more," Catherine continued, handing them the sealed letter Eleanor had left. Somehow she knew what he might do. "Read this." Walter reverently accepted the letter and began to read aloud. "My dearest Catherine and Ethan, if you are reading this, it means my suspicions were correct, and Arthur has acted against me. I don't fear so much for myself as for my precious son. Arthur has changed over the years. Power and greed have consumed the man I once loved, turning him into someone I barely recognize. I discovered evidence of his illegal dealings, his connections with corrupt politicians, his willingness to destroy lives to increase his fortune. When I confronted him, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me. Not anger, but a cold calculation that made me realize I had become an obstacle in his path. I modified my will to protect Ethan. I know this will make my son a target, but I've also put other protections in place. The documents accompanying this letter contain all the evidence I've gathered, enough to destroy not only Arthur's empire, but also his freedom. Catherine, I trust you to protect Ethan if I cannot. And Ethan, my dear son, always remember, your music is your strength. Through it, you can communicate with the world in ways that many with perfect sight never will. Don't let the darkness your father chose affect the light that exists within you. With all my love, Eleanor." When Walter finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the cabin. Ethan hugged the violin against his chest, as if he were embracing his mother herself. "She knew," he murmured. "She knew and did everything she could to protect me, even knowing it might cost her life. And now," Catherine declared with fierce determination, "we're going to make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. Arthur Blackwood will finally face justice." "We need to act fast," David warned. "Take this evidence directly to the state prosecutor, bypassing Sergeant Miller. If Arthur suspects we have this..." His words were interrupted by the distant but unmistakable sound of a powerful engine approaching along the main road leading to town. "Wait," David said, suddenly alert. "I know that sound. It's Arthur Blackwood's Ferrari." The four exchanged alarmed glances. Arthur coming to town outside of his usual search times was certainly no coincidence. "He knows," Catherine concluded, her face pale. "Somehow he found out." "We need to get out of here now," Walter decided, already gathering essentials. "If he's coming to town, it's only a matter of time before he finds out we're in this cabin." "I know an alternate route," David offered. "Through the mountains, it leads to a back road where we can get a car without being noticed." "Let's go," Catherine agreed, carefully placing the documents in her bag. "Every minute counts now." As the four hurried out the back door of the cabin, the sound of Arthur's sports car engine grew closer and closer, a sinister omen of the confrontation that inevitably awaited them. The trail David had indicated snaked through the mountains like an artery forgotten by time, narrow and treacherous in several sections, but invisible to anyone watching from the main road. The group moved with calculated haste, fast enough to gain distance, but cautious enough not to leave obvious tracks or risk a fall in the steeper areas. Walter led the way, his familiarity with the mountainous terrain serving them well. Catherine had left for the state capital, promising to return with Eleanor's lawyer and the documents that would prove Arthur's crimes. Meanwhile, David had returned to town to discreetly monitor the businessman's movements, keeping in contact via a short-range radio. "Where exactly are we going?" Ethan asked, his fingers gripping the violin case tightly as he moved with surprising agility over the rough terrain. "To St. Benedict's Monastery," Walter replied. "It's about a 4-hour hike from here, high in the mountains. For centuries, it has sheltered people in danger. The monks have a code of honor. They don't hand over anyone who seeks refuge within. For their walls." Ethan nodded, trusting the old man's decision. His other senses, sharpened by years of adapting to blindness, picked up every nuance of the environment. The moss under his feet, the cold wind on his cheeks, the distant sound of running water, the scent of pine trees and damp earth. "The monastery has incredible acoustics," Walter continued, trying to keep the boys' spirits up. "They say that when someone plays music in there, the sound lingers in the air for minutes, as if the very walls want to preserve the beauty." A small smile formed on Ethan's lips. "I'd like to experience that." Meanwhile, Arthur Blackwood arrived at the abandoned cabin, followed by 2 police officers loyal to Sergeant Miller and his private security. Finding the place empty, his face twisted into a mask of fury. "Search everything," he ordered. "I want to know where they went." His men searched the place quickly, finding few traces of Ethan and Walter's recent presence. It was one of the police officers who discovered the crucial clue, a small worn pamphlet about St. Benedict's Monastery, left on a shelf. "Sir," he called out, handing the pamphlet to Arthur, "I think I know where they might have gone." Arthur examined the paper, a cold smile forming on his lips. "Of course. The old fisherman seeks sanctuary at the monastery." Turning to his men, he ordered, "You guys keep searching the area. I'll go to the monastery myself." "Alone, sir?" one of the security guards questioned, surprised. "This is personal," Arthur replied, his voice carrying a sinister tone that left no room for argument. "And I know a shortcut that will allow me to get there before them." Without waiting for a response, Arthur headed to his luxury car, determined to intercept his son and the old fisherman before they reached the monastery's protection. The path he knew was rarely used, an old service road that cut through the mountain on a more direct route, but notoriously dangerous, especially for vehicles not suited for the terrain. As Arthur sped along the main road before veering onto the shortcut, he noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was approaching, but this only increased his determination. He needed to reach the monastery first, at any cost. Walter and Ethan had traveled about halfway when the first drops of rain began to fall. The sky had darkened rapidly, and distant thunder announced the approach of a significant storm. "We need to take shelter," Walter declared, watching the threatening sky with concern. "I know a cave not far from here. We can wait out the worst of the storm." Ethan nodded, tightening his jacket around himself as the rain intensified. Diverting from the main path, they followed a smaller trail that led to the mentioned cave. The route took them across an old service road, partially overgrown with vegetation after years of disuse. That's when they heard the sound, the unmistakable roar of a powerful engine, followed by a metallic crash and the sound of breaking glass. "Sounds like someone had an accident," Walter said, hesitating. "Should we check it out?" Ethan had already changed direction, instinctively moving towards the sound. It might be someone needing help. Reluctantly, Walter followed the boy. After a few yards down the old road, they came upon the scene. A red Ferrari had skidded on the wet pavement and flipped over, landing on its roof. Trapped beneath the vehicle, a man groaned in pain, trying uselessly to free himself. "Help!" the weak voice called out. "Please, someone—" Ethan froze, immediately recognizing the voice. It's my father." Walter also realized, instinctively grabbing Ethan's arm. "Let's go. He was coming after us. This is our chance to get away." But Ethan remained still, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "We can't leave him here, he'll die." "He tried to kill you," Walter reminded him, his voice an urgent whisper. "He doesn't deserve your compassion." "I'm not doing this for him," Ethan replied, his voice surprisingly firm. "I'm doing it for myself, for who I choose to be." Walter looked at the boy, recognizing in him an extraordinary wisdom and compassion. After a long moment of internal conflict, the old man sighed. "You're right. We can't sink to his level." Cautiously approaching the flipped car, Walter assessed the situation with experienced eyes. Arthur was trapped by his torso under the vehicle, but miraculously conscious. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his breathing seemed labored. "Blackwood," Walter said, kneeling down to get a better look at the trapped man. Arthur, through the pain and confusion, focused his eyes on the old man's face. "You," he murmured, recognition and then despair crossing his features. "Please, help me." "Ethan," Walter called, "I need you to find that log over there. We're going to use it as leverage." The boy moved with determination, locating the fallen log by the sound of Walter's footsteps. Together, using rocks as fulcrums, they managed to partially lift the vehicle, enough for Walter to pull Arthur out. The businessman cried out in pain during the process, collapsing unconscious as soon as he was free. Walter quickly checked his vital signs and examined his injuries. "He's alive," he announced. "He has some broken ribs, possibly internal injuries, and his right leg looks fractured. We need to get him somewhere dry." "The cave you mentioned?" Ethan suggested. Walter shook his head, realizing his decision had already been made. "No, my cabin is closer from here than I thought. We have medicine and supplies there, and this storm, it looks like it's going to last for days." Improvising a stretcher, with branches and his own coat, Walter managed to carry Arthur through the woods, with Ethan helping to navigate the way back. The rain had turned into a violent storm, with howling winds and thunder that shook the very mountain. They arrived at the cabin, exhausted and soaked. Carefully, they settled Arthur on Walter's bed. The old man immediately began treating the businessman's injuries, revealing surprisingly sophisticated medical knowledge. "You seem to know what you're doing," Ethan observed, sitting nearby, listening intently to every sound. "I was a medic before I became a fisherman," Walter explained as he cleaned and bandaged the wounds. "I worked in war zones, treating victims in much worse conditions than this cabin." Over the next few hours, Walter alternated between monitoring Arthur's condition and checking the news on the small radio. The storm had caused landslides, blocking all access roads to the mountain. They were completely isolated. "We'll be stuck," Here for at least 3 days until the crews can clear the roads, Walter informed Ethan as he prepared a herbal tea. Ethan nodded, his fingers moving instinctively over the strings of the violin he hadn't let go of, even during his father's rescue. 3 days trapped with the man who tried to kill me, he murmured, a note of irony in his voice. Fate has a peculiar sense of humor. We can use this time to decide what to do when the storm passes, Walter suggested. Your Aunt Catherine mentioned she would return with important documents. If she can get through the storm, Ethan pondered. The next morning, Arthur woke up confused and disoriented by the pain. His eyes scanned the rustic surroundings until they focused on Walter, who was preparing a medicinal brew near the wood-burning stove. Where am I? He asked, his voice hoarse. In my cabin, Walter replied without turning around. The same one you threw us out of. Arthur tried to move, groaning with the pain in his ribs. Why did you save me? It wasn't for you, the old man replied simply. It was for him. At that moment, Ethan emerged from the small adjacent room, drawn by his father's voice. He stopped in the doorway, his face a carefully neutral mask. Ethan, Arthur whispered, a mixture of emotions crossing his face, surprise, shame, and something else difficult to identify. The boy didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said simply, "You need to rest to recover. We're all stuck here, until the storm passes." The following days established an uncomfortable routine in the small cabin. Walter tended to Arthur's injuries with professional efficiency, but little warmth. Ethan helped with household chores, preparing teas, organizing supplies, keeping the fire lit, demonstrating an independence and competence that clearly surprised his father. In his spare time, Ethan played his violin. Initially, he would retreat to the small covered porch, as if wanting to keep his music private. But as the storm persisted, he began to play in the main room, his melodies filling the confined space with a beauty that contrasted dramatically with the tension between the 3 occupants. Arthur watched his son in silence, an enigmatic expression on his face. On the second day, he finally spoke as Ethan finished a particularly moving piece. "I never really stopped to listen to you play," he admitted. "It's extraordinary." Ethan paused, his fingers still on the strings. "Mom always listened," he replied simply. A heavy silence followed the mention of Eleanor. Walter glanced from one to the other, feeling the weight of unspoken words. "Your mother was right about your talent," Arthur continued surprisingly. "I was too busy with other things to notice." "Things like planning my murder?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but laced with pain. Arthur closed his eyes, the weight of the undeniable accusation hanging between them. "There's no explanation that can justify what I did," he finally said, "or what I planned to do." "No, there isn't," Ethan agreed, "but I'd like to understand why. You're my father. Part of me always wanted to believe that somehow you loved me." The vulnerability in the boy's voice made something break inside Arthur. For the first time in years, maybe decades, genuine tears welled up in his eyes. "I lost my way," he confessed, his voice almost inaudible. "At some point, power and money became everything to me. I convinced myself they were measures of success, of worth. When your mother changed her will, I didn't see my son being protected. I only saw someone taking what I considered rightfully mine." "The empire you built with her money," Walter observed dryly. Arthur didn't deny it. "Yes, the empire I built with her money, with often shady connections, with decisions that slowly eroded any decency I once had." Looking directly at Ethan, he continued, "You became a symbol of everything I was losing. Not a person. An obstacle, not my son. It's unforgivable, I know." Ethan remained silent for a long moment. "Did you kill my mother?" he finally asked, the question that had haunted his thoughts since hearing his aunt's suspicions. Arthur's silence was answer. "Enough. She found out about your illegal dealings," Ethan continued, "and you silenced her." "I convinced myself I had no choice," Arthur replied, his voice choked with emotion. "Another unforgivable mistake among so many." On the night of the 3rd day, as the storm finally subsided, Ethan played a melody that made Arthur freeze, the lullaby Eleanor had composed when their son was born. She used to play this for me every night, Ethan explained when he finished. She said music was a way of seeing with the heart, not with the eyes. I remember, Arthur murmured. In the early years, I would sometimes stop at your bedroom door and listen to you both. What happened to you? Ethan asked, genuinely curious. To the man who stopped at the door to listen, Arthur reflected for a long time. He was seduced by the illusion that more power, more money, more control would bring some kind of lasting satisfaction, a satisfaction that never came. On the morning of the fourth day, the sun finally appeared. The roads were still blocked, but the radio announced that crews were working to clear them. That's when they heard the sound of an approaching helicopter. That must be your aunt, Walter commented, looking out the window. She mentioned she would use every resource available to return quickly. Minutes later, Catherine entered the cabin, accompanied by a formal man carrying a briefcase, Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor's personal lawyer. Her surprise at seeing Arthur was evident. "What's he doing here?" she asked, immediately protective. Briefly, Walter explained the accident and the rescue. Catherine looked incredulously from Ethan to Arthur, who remained silently on his makeshift bed. "I brought the documents," she finally announced, placing her briefcase on the table. Everything. Eleanor gathered. Proof of corruption, fraud, and... She hesitated, looking at Ethan. The autopsy report she secretly commissioned in case something happened to her. "And it did," Ethan completed. "Yes," Catherine confirmed sadly. "There's also a letter for you, Ethan, and one for Arthur." Everyone looked at Catherine in surprise. "For me?" Arthur questioned. Catherine nodded, taking 2 envelopes from her briefcase. She handed the first to Ethan, who ran his fingers over the paper, feeling the embossed handwriting his mother always used for him. The second she hesitantly extended to Arthur. Ethan asked Walter to read his letter aloud. "My dearest Ethan, if you are reading this, it means my suspicions were confirmed, and I am no longer there to protect you personally. But know that my love and protection transcend physical presence. I am modifying my will not only to secure your financial future, but to protect you from the man your father has become. The Arthur I knew and loved years ago has disappeared, consumed by ambition and greed. I fear what he might do when he discovers what I have done. But I also leave a letter for him, in the hope, perhaps naive, that some spark of that man still exists and can be rekindled. I knew your father's heart before the world hardened it. I know that somewhere beneath layers of coldness and calculation lies the capacity to love. Ethan, your gift for music is extraordinary. Never allow the darkness of this world to diminish the light that emanates from you when you play. Your blindness has never been a limitation. On the contrary, it has given you the ability to see beauty where others only see the superficial. Trust your Aunt Catherine and the good people who will surely cross your path. And if one day, against all odds, the father you knew in the early years of your life returns, allow yourself the possibility of forgiveness, not for him, but for yourself. With eternal love, Mom." When Walter finished, silent tears streamed down Ethan's face. Arthur, with trembling hands, opened his own envelope and read in silence. Whatever it contained, it completely transformed his expression. For several minutes, he remained still, the letter clutched in his hands, a mixture of pain and understanding on his face. "What did she write?" Ethan finally asked. Arthur took a deep breath. "She reminded me of who I was, of who I promised to be for both of you, and she forgave me for what I became, even knowing what I might do." His voice faltered. "A forgiveness I don't deserve." Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "There's also the legal matter. I have enough documents here to send Mr. Blackwood to prison for decades. Murder, attempted murder, fraud, corruption. The list is extensive." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Surprisingly, it was Ethan who broke it. "What if there was another way?" he asked. "One that honored my mother's memory, but also allowed for redemption?" Everyone looked at the boy, surprised. "What kind of way?" Catherine questioned skeptically. Ethan turned in his father's direction. "Everything you've built, all your businesses and influence, what if they were redirected towards something genuinely good? If the fortune you considered so important was used to help people like me, children who face challenges but have dreams and talents. Arthur stared at his son, seeing for the first time the extraordinary person he was. Not just an obstacle, not just an heir, but a human being of remarkable compassion and wisdom. "Are you suggesting I shouldn't pay for my crimes?" he asked, incredulous. "I'm suggesting there's more than one way to pay," Ethan replied. "Prison will punish you, yes, but what will change in the world? If there is truly any remorse in you, prove it not only by accepting punishment, but by creating something positive out of so much negative." In the following weeks, as Arthur physically recovered, a deeper transformation was taking place. With Mr. Caldwell's guidance, he voluntarily confessed his financial crimes to the authorities, accepting severe penalties but avoiding prison through an extraordinary agreement. The transfer of control of his empire to an independent board of directors and the creation of a foundation dedicated to visually impaired children. Eleanor's death officially remained a heart attack, not due to a lack of evidence, but due to Ethan's conscious decision to honor the spirit of forgiveness expressed in his mother's letter. Was it perfect justice? No, but it was a way to transform a tragedy into something that could benefit countless lives. Catherine and Walter became joint legal guardians of Ethan, creating an arrangement where the boy divided his time between the city and the mountains. Arthur, stripped of most of his fortune and power, began the long journey of reconnecting with his son, not as an heir or an extension of himself, but as an independent person with his own gifts and worldview. 2 months later, the Grand Theatre, in the state capital, hosted Ethan Blackwood's first official concert, a benefit event to launch the newly formed Eleanor Blackwood Foundation for young visually impaired musicians. In the front row, side by side in an arrangement that would have seemed impossible weeks before, sat Arthur and Walter. The piece Ethan presented, titled Rebirth, blended his mother's lullaby with melodies inspired by the mountains where he had found refuge and courage. Each note seemed to tell the journey from despair to hope, from betrayal to the possibility, still fragile, still under construction, of reconciliation. As the last chords faded into